Germany, May 1945. The war in Europe is over, but its echoes linger in the walls of every camp, every uniform, every stare. Inside a US-run prisoner-of-war compound, a low morning mist drifts between the barbed wire fences. The air smells of damp wood and diesel. American guards stand watch, tired, unshaven men who have seen too much death to be moved by anything human. Then a convoy halts. From the trucks step German women in grey Luftwaffe and Wehrmacht uniforms, officers, nurses, communication staff. Their boots strike the gravel with the precision of soldiers who once served an empire now turned to ash. The guards glance up, curious, uncertain. And then something unexpected happens. One by one, the Americans rise from their seats. No orders, no words, just silence and respect. Even the captured women pause, unsure if this is mockery or honor. But in that quiet moment, among the ruins of war, a strange kind of dignity returns to the battlefield. The moment passes. The guards resume their posts, and the women are led inside the compound. But behind that brief gesture lies the long, complex story of how they came to be there, and how two armies, once enemies, could still share the discipline of soldiers. By the final years of the Second World War, the German Reich was collapsing on all fronts. In 1944, the Wehrmacht faced an impossible situation. The Red Army pressing in from the east, the Allies landing from the west, and the skies dominated by Allied bombers that struck with impunity. Every able-bodied man was already at the front. To fill the void, the German High Command turned increasingly to women. They were not front-line combatants, but they carried ranks, wore uniforms, and held the weight of the collapsing empire on their shoulders. They worked in the communications corps, decoding messages and operating radio networks in underground bunkers. They manned anti-aircraft batteries as assistants, served as medics and nurses near bombed-out hospitals, and ran logistics depots that kept the remnants of the army alive. Some were daughters of officers. Others were volunteers who had believed in the duty of service, if not the ideology that drove it. By 1945, more than 500,000 women served in auxiliary positions across the German armed forces, the Wehrmachthelferinnen or female helpers. They swore oaths, received ranks, and lived under military law. To the Allied command, this blurred an old line. These were not civilians, nor were they typical combatants. When the Allied forces advanced deep into Germany in April and May of 1945, they encountered thousands of such women in uniforms, from the Luftwaffe Signal Corps, the Army's transport divisions, and the SS's administrative branches. Most surrendered quietly. They were exhausted, hungry, and uncertain of what awaited them. For many, surrendering to the Americans or British was considered survival itself, a small miracle compared to the feared Soviet captivity to the east. The Western Allies had little precedent for this. The Geneva Convention of 1929 had defined rules for male prisoners of war. Female soldiers were rare in modern combat, and their treatment was often improvised on the ground. Yet, to their credit, US commanders insisted that military women captured in uniform be processed under the same POW code as men. They were to be given rank respect, officer privileges, and humane conditions. Among the earliest groups captured were members of the Luftwaffe Women's Auxiliary Service near Frankfurt and Munich. They were placed in temporary holding sites before transfer to secure US zones in France and southern Germany. These were not concentration camps. They were formal military installations, governed by order and protocol. Still, the atmosphere was heavy. Germany had just surrendered. Cities lay in ruins, millions were displaced, and rumors of atrocities darkened every conversation. American soldiers, many having lost comrades in Europe, carried deep bitterness toward anything bearing the Nazi insignia. And yet, when faced with these women, disciplined, uniformed, and silent, something in the psychology of soldiers shifted. It was not sympathy. It was not forgiveness. It was recognition that beyond ideology, the uniform still carried the weight of service, the shared understanding of hierarchy, and the quiet endurance of war. Most of the captured female officers were between 20 and 30 years old. Many had served as clerks or communications specialists in Luftwaffe field divisions. They had seen their bases bombed, their commanders surrender, and their orders dissolve into chaos. Some had burned papers until the last hour before the Allies entered their compounds. Others had helped tend to wounded soldiers long after command structures collapsed. Their capture was orderly, even courteous. US personnel recorded names, ranks, and serial numbers. No Allied propaganda cameras were present. This was not spectacle. But what stood out in later testimonies, especially from the Red Cross and US camp officers, was the dignity with which these women carried themselves. They saluted correctly, stood at attention, and behaved not as victims but as officers who had accepted defeat with discipline. In the eyes of American guards hardened by war, that composure commanded an unexpected kind of respect. For the first time, they faced the enemy not as a faceless aggressor, but as fellow soldiers who had simply worn a different uniform. And so, when those German female officers entered the camp and the Americans stood, it was not a political act. It was an instinctive response, the recognition of soldiers by soldiers. That moment, though fleeting, would echo through the official records and memories of those who witnessed it, a reminder that honor could outlive empires. In the spring of 1945, the United States Army found itself managing one of the largest populations of prisoners of war in modern history. Across Western Europe alone, over 3.4 million German soldiers were in Allied custody. Camps sprang up across France, Belgium, and Germany, temporary cities of wire and discipline. But in this vast network of captivity, one category of prisoner stood out: the female officers and auxiliaries of the defeated Reich. The US military had long prided itself on adherence to the Geneva Convention of 1929, which guaranteed humane treatment of POWs. Every prisoner was to be fed, clothed, and sheltered according to standards of the detaining power's own troops. But nowhere did that convention mention women in uniform. For centuries, war had been a man's domain. The sudden presence of German female personnel, armed with rank and insignia, forced the US command to improvise policy in real time. At first, some field officers considered them civilian detainees. Others argued they were lawful prisoners of war, since they wore military insignia and had been part of command structures. The final decision rested with the office of the Provost Marshal General, which instructed that all female military auxiliaries captured in uniform were to be treated as POWs under Article 3 of the Convention. That single decision changed everything. It meant that, legally, a captured Luftwaffe communications officer or Wehrmacht nurse with officer rank had to receive the same treatment as a captured male lieutenant. Separate facilities were required. Respect for rank was mandatory. Guard behavior was regulated under strict codes of military conduct. Many of these women were held in temporary transit camps in France and southern Germany, most notably at sites near Cherbourg, Heidelberg, and Augsburg, before being moved further west. Others were eventually transported to the United States for processing and internment, particularly through the port of Le Havre. Among these destinations was Fort Oglethorpe, Georgia, a large American camp once used to train the Women's Army Corps, WWII. By late 1945, it also served as a processing site for select German female prisoners, including officers, nurses, and Red Cross workers. For the American staff, the assignment was unusual. Many had served in Europe. Some had seen their friends killed by forces these same women had once supported. And yet, the strict professionalism of the US Army demanded something more than vengeance. It demanded discipline. In the reports of Major William R. Dorsey, a camp commandant in 1945, an unusual note appears. Prisoners arrived composed, orderly, and correct in manner. The guards displayed restraint and courtesy, consistent with military respect. That last phrase, consistent with military respect, speaks volumes. Even in defeat, the German female officers carried themselves with the bearing of trained professionals. They addressed American officers formally, saluted when spoken to, and followed protocol precisely. This formality disarmed their captors. It was one thing to face enemy combatants broken and defiant. It was another to face them calm, uniformed, and dignified. The American command understood the power of example. Guards were reminded daily that the treatment of prisoners reflected the moral difference between democracy and tyranny. In one internal memo, an officer wrote, "We are not here to humiliate the defeated. We are here to prove that civilization survives the battlefield." Still, discipline was tested. Some guards admitted that the mere sight of German uniforms, even worn by women, brought back memories of bombed convoys and fallen friends. But as days passed, familiarity dulled hatred. The German women worked in assigned duties: cleaning, clerical assistance, hospital aid. They followed orders, never complained, and in time even helped organize their quarters with the precision of an army barracks. Their conduct stirred unexpected respect. It wasn't compassion. It was professionalism recognizing professionalism. And among the US ranks, that respect began to take form in quiet gestures, standing when officers entered, saluting when addressed, maintaining decorum at all times. There was no propaganda attached to it, no newspaper stories or staged photographs. The war had been too brutal, too fresh for anyone to romanticize the enemy. But in the orderliness of captivity, the remnants of soldierly honor survived. For historians, the moment when American guards stood up as German female officers entered a room has become symbolic, not for what it glorified, but for what it preserved, the last thread of dignity in a war defined by its moral collapse. The camps themselves operated efficiently. Red Cross inspections noted that food rations, medical care, and personal conduct standards met the convention's requirements. Letters were permitted, though censored. Religious services were allowed, and most importantly, rank was observed. Some German female officers even remarked in post-war interviews that they had been treated with fairness uncommon in war. For many, the psychological shock lay not in captivity, but in respect. They had been trained to expect humiliation, even abuse. Instead, they encountered silence, protocol, and a level of courtesy that, for a moment, transcended nations. As summer 1945 turned to autumn, these quiet interactions repeated across dozens of camps. Each encounter between captor and captive became a small negotiation of honor, a test of whether civilization could still exist amid the ruins of global conflict. And it was in those moments, when American guards stood at attention for German women who once served an enemy empire, that the faint line between victory and humanity blurred. For the German women who arrived at the American camps in 1945, captivity was not simply the loss of freedom. It was the collapse of a world they had been trained to uphold. Many had joined the Luftwaffe auxiliaries or Wehrmacht Signals Corps in their early 20s. They had believed they were serving their nation, not an ideology. They had sworn oaths, worn uniforms, and lived under orders. And when the Reich fell, the weight of those oaths did not vanish. The transition from soldier to prisoner was one of quiet humiliation. They no longer marched, they were counted. They no longer gave orders, they followed them. And yet, among many of them, discipline did not die. It became their armor, a way to preserve dignity in defeat. In diaries later recovered by the Red Cross and the German archives, several women wrote about those first weeks in American hands. One former Luftwaffe signals officer recalled, "They treated us as officers, not as women. That distinction was important. It reminded us we were soldiers first." For the women who had lived through the collapse of Germany, witnessing their comrades surrender, their leaders vanish, and their cities burn, The civility of the Americans was almost surreal. In some camps, US personnel even allowed them to organize roll calls, maintain officer hierarchies, and salute their own ranks. What might have been a routine act of processing prisoners became an unspoken experiment in post-war humanity. The American guards, too, carried their own psychological burdens. Most were battle-worn veterans, men who had fought across Normandy, the Ardennes, or the Rhine. They had seen what the Wehrmacht could do. Some had liberated concentration camps only WWII earlier. Hatred ran deep. And yet, when these men faced German female officers, soldiers without weapons, standing upright in neat grey uniforms, something shifted. The instinct for revenge gave way to professional reflex. In the US Army, respect for rank and discipline was drilled as sacred. No matter who stood before you, if they carried themselves with military bearing, you responded accordingly. So when the first group of captured German female officers entered the processing hall, the guards rose. They did not salute, they simply stood. A small gesture, but one that spoke louder than words. Later testimonies suggest that this reaction was not planned nor ordered. It was spontaneous, the natural recognition of soldiers by soldiers. In that instant, uniforms ceased to represent ideology. They represented service, endurance, and shared suffering. This act did not go unnoticed. Among the female prisoners, it caused deep confusion. Some assumed mockery, others felt pride, that even in defeat, their discipline commanded respect. But as days passed and the same courtesy was repeated, its sincerity became clear. American guards stood when officers entered, not because they agreed with them, but because they refused to abandon their own code of conduct. This became one of the most striking examples of cultural shock in the post-war months. In Nazi Germany, women in military roles had lived within strict patriarchal hierarchies. Their worth was often defined by loyalty and service, not autonomy. In the United States, by contrast, the presence of women in uniform, through the Women's Army Corps, symbolized progress and equality. Thus, when American soldiers met German female officers, they confronted an enemy that was both familiar and alien. The women before them had once supported a regime responsible for global suffering, yet they stood with dignity, spoke with discipline, and carried themselves as soldiers. To the Americans, this was dissonant, but also disarming. They could not dehumanize what stood upright before them. At the same time, it reflected a subtle cultural education within the US Army itself. American soldiers were repeatedly reminded that victory meant more than defeating the enemy. It meant being better than the enemy. Every order from high command stressed discipline, respect for the Geneva Convention, and moral restraint. The image of American soldiers standing while German female officers entered a room was not just a gesture. It was the manifestation of that ideal. Still, not all saw it that way. For some Allied observers, especially in war-torn Europe, the idea of showing respect to enemy personnel seemed offensive. But for those inside the camps, for the men who had lived through the brutality, the gesture had nothing to do with politics. It was personal. It was human. As one US sergeant later wrote in a post-war letter to his brother, "They were the enemy, yes, but they carried themselves with the same kind of pride we were told never to lose. Maybe that's why we stood up." The act became a quiet lesson in the endurance of soldierly ethics, that in war's aftermath, discipline could survive where compassion could not. And for the women who experienced it, that small courtesy, the standing of guards, became one of the most haunting memories of their captivity. To them, it was proof that even the victors could recognize their service. To history, it became evidence that dignity does not belong only to the triumphant. The echoes of that moment reached far beyond the camp walls, into the moral and cultural debates of a post-war world struggling to redefine what honor meant after so much destruction. In every army, respect is a form of order. It is not affection nor forgiveness. It is recognition of structure, discipline, and the shared endurance of those who serve under command. For the American officers overseeing POW operations, the act of standing for situ, captured German female officers, was not sentimental. It was rooted in leadership, in the idea that even in victory, professionalism defined the soldier. By 1945, U.S. command policy emphasized that how one treated the defeated was a measure of civilization itself. General Dwight D. Eisenhower had made it clear months earlier, "We will not become what we fight." To humiliate an enemy, even a fallen one, was to betray the very ideals that separated democracy from tyranny. Within the chain of command, this principle flowed downward, from officers to guards, from policy to instinct. So when the American guards stood as those German women entered the hall, they were not just honoring individuals, they were upholding a code. Leadership and morality in war often exist in tension. Leaders must demand discipline under chaos, control under rage. Yet, true leadership, the kind the U.S. Army sought to model in 1945, was measured not by destruction, but by restraint. Respecting the enemy was not weakness. It was mastery over hatred. American guards had been trained to stand when an officer entered, regardless of nationality, as long as that officer retained formal rank. Even though the women before them belonged to a defeated force, they were technically officers until processed otherwise. Standing was not admiration. It was procedure, discipline, and humanity aligned. But symbolism often transcends intention. To the German female officers, that gesture became something far larger. For them, everything had collapsed: their country, their leadership, their faith in victory. They entered captivity expecting scorn, expecting to be stripped not only of freedom but of dignity. And yet the sight of their captors rising in silent respect, even briefly, carried a message they would never forget, that they were still seen as soldiers. In a world where women in uniform had long been viewed as auxiliaries, as helpers rather than warriors, that act carried profound psychological weight. It erased the boundary between female and soldier for a fleeting moment. "They stood for us," one recalled years later. "I did not know whether to cry or salute." That act, so simple, cut through ideology and gender alike, and revealed something about the human cost of discipline. Both sides had lived through years of indoctrination, one raised to fight for freedom, the other for Führer and fatherland. Yet both still recognized the ritual of respect. War had divided nations, but not the language of soldiers. This symbolism of standing up reverberated quietly through POW networks. Stories spread, from camp to camp, whispered among German prisoners. The Americans stood for the women. In those whispers, the meaning changed. To some, it was proof of American civility. To others, a reminder that defeat did not erase worth. And to historians, it became an unspoken chapter of moral endurance in a time defined by moral collapse. Yet outside the camp walls, another battle was unfolding, the battle of perception and propaganda. For the Allied public, compassion toward Germans in 1945 was a delicate subject. The world had just seen the horrors of concentration camps. Millions were displaced. Cities were ashes. Any gesture of respect toward German officers, even women, risked being misinterpreted as weakness or sympathy for the enemy. Therefore, no official record, no photograph, no press statement was ever released about those moments. They existed only in recollections, camp reports, and private testimonies. The act of standing remained unwritten, because it did not fit neatly into the narrative of victory and punishment. Yet in its silence lay its power. The gesture needed no camera, no witness, no propaganda. It was an act between soldiers, preserved in the dignity of behavior rather than the permanence of paper. In later decades, historians studying Allied POW policies began to see these moments as small indicators of a greater transit, ion, from war's brutality toward a fragile post-war morality. The respect shown in those camps hinted at the ethical framework that would later define Western military conduct: professionalism over vengeance, order over chaos. For many American officers, the reasoning was pragmatic as much as moral. They believed that humane treatment of prisoners would encourage cooperation, reduce resistance, and strengthen post-war stability. But beneath that reasoning lay a deeper truth, one learned only by those who had seen war's extremes, that hatred cannot sustain discipline forever. And so, what might have appeared a trivial gesture, guards standing for their prisoners, became in essence the last expression of military honor amid total ruin. In that gesture lived the paradox of the modern soldier, trained to destroy, yet bound by codes that preserve humanity. The women who witnessed it would carry that image with them through decades of silence. The men who enacted it would rarely speak of it. But history would remember, not through documents but through the enduring idea that respect, even for one's enemy, defines the difference between victory and civilization. The scene now shifts, from the quiet moral gesture to the moment it actually occurred, the day when those German female officers walked into the hall and every American guard rose to their feet. The convoy stopped just after dawn. Cold air drifted through the pine trees surrounding the camp, a U.S. Army prisoner of war reception center somewhere in southern Germany, late May 1945. The war was over, but the atmosphere still carried the taut silence of battlefields not yet forgotten. Inside the compound, rows of American guards went about their morning routines. Some cleaned rifles, others logged paperwork or stood at watchtowers. Most had been in uniform for years, weary men who had seen Europe burn town by town. To them, the arrival of new prisoners was routine. Trains and trucks brought thousands daily, defeated soldiers, refugees, nurses, clerks. Each carried a story, and all looked the same in surrender, tired and grey. But this morning was different. A U.S. military truck convoy rolled up, escorted by jeeps. The gates opened and a dozen German vehicles followed inside. The guards watched as a small group of prisoners stepped down from the transport trucks, about 40 women, all in military uniform. Their insignia identified them as Luftwaffe and Wehrmacht auxiliaries, several with officer rank tabs and ribbons from years of service. The women formed neat lines without instruction. No voices rose, no one argued or stumbled. Their discipline was unmistakable, posture straight, eyes forward, movements crisp even in captivity. Among them stood Oberleutnant Ingrid Hoffmann, a signals officer from the 1st Luftnachrichten Regiment. She had served through the bombings of Hamburg and the collapse of Berlin's command network. To her, captivity meant survival, but not surrender of spirit. An American sergeant at the gate muttered to another, "They look like they're still on parade." Inside the processing hall, the atmosphere grew tense. The guards had been briefed. Handle the new arrivals carefully. Treat them as officers under the Geneva Convention. Maintain order. No mockery, no familiarity. Yet when the doors opened and the first group of German female officers entered, something unusual happened. Something no regulation had anticipated. The women walked in pairs, their boots tapping softly against the wooden floor. The light from the windows caught the silver buttons of their tunics. And as they crossed the threshold, every American guard in the room instinctively rose to his feet. No one commanded it. No officer shouted an order. It was reflex, deep, automatic, the kind, learned in barracks long before war and hatred had divided the world. They stood because soldiers stand when officers enter a room. It was that simple, and that profound. The women halted, surprised. Their faces showed disbelief, then confusion. Some assumed irony. Others felt anger. They had expected to be treated as prisoners, not honored. But there was no laughter, no sneer, no applause, only silence. The American guards stood straight, eyes forward, hands at their sides. For a full 30 seconds, no one moved. Even the air seemed to stop, as if history itself had paused to take note. To those present, it felt less like a gesture of courtesy and more like an instinct of recognition, two sides of the same profession meeting in the ruins of ideology. The guards did not see enemies now. They saw soldiers stripped of command, but not of bearing. Major Dorsey, the camp commandant, recorded the event in his daily log later that week. His entry was brief but telling. Female officers entered, guards rose. No disturbance, conduct exemplary. That was all. Yet within those words lay the essence of the moment, professionalism surviving the collapse of nations. For the women, that silent acknowledgement was disorienting. Some broke down in tears later that night, others refused to speak of it. In the days that followed, a few confided in Red Cross workers. We expected humiliation. Instead, they gave us respect. It was harder to bear. That single gesture echoed far beyond the hall. Guards began to repeat it whenever the women passed, quietly, consistently, without instruction. And each time, the same stillness filled the air. What might have been an insignificant procedural habit became, for those inside the camp, an unspoken symbol, the last ritual of discipline shared between former enemies. American officers did not publicize it. There was no report to headquarters. There was no mention in the press. But among the guards, it became a story told in low voices over evening coffee. They carried themselves like we used to, one said. So we stood, that's all. Even years later, in letters and memoirs, veterans would recall that morning. None could fully explain it. Perhaps it was guilt, perhaps admiration, perhaps just the stubborn refusal of soldiers to abandon respect, even when war demanded hatred. But for a brief instant, in a small hall in occupied Germany, victory and defeat ceased to matter. Only discipline remained, a final link between enemies who understood one another more than either side wished to admit. The sound of boots on wooden floors faded. The women were processed, fingerprinted, assigned to barracks. The guards sat down again. The war went on in paperwork and silence. Yet everyone who witnessed it knew something had shifted. A small, wordless moment when the moral order of warfare flickered back to life amid the ruins. In the days that followed that silent salute, something subtle began to shift inside the camp. It was not rebellion, not sympathy. It was simply recognition. The US Guards, mostly veterans of Normandy, the Ardennes and the Rhineland, had spent years fighting an enemy painted in propaganda as monstrous. Yet here, behind barbed wire, they found themselves face to face with women who mirrored the same posture, the same discipline, the same fatigue etched into their own faces. Word of the scene spread quietly. The incident, the morning the guards stood, was spoken of in the mess hall, then along the sentry posts, and finally across the rows of barracks where German prisoners sat in uneasy silence. One corporal told another. They weren't Nazis in that moment, just soldiers. For the American camp officers, this created an unusual tension. Military decorum required maintaining the boundaries of captivity. No fraternization, no unnisi, sorry gestures. But even the commandant, Major Dorsey, understood what had happened. His journal entry a week later was more reflective. We stood because that is what soldiers do. It wasn't politics, it was habit, or maybe conscience. Among the German women, the gesture ignited conflicting emotions. They had prepared themselves for humiliation. Many had destroyed their insignia before capture, expecting insult or ridicule. Instead, they found themselves greeted with a gesture that belonged to a vanished world of order and code. For some, it reopened a wound, the knowledge that all the precision, training, and pride that once defined their service now existed only in memory. For others, it was a kind of closure. They could now accept defeat without losing dignity. Inside the women's compound, the tone of conversation changed. The first night after arrival, silence reigned. By the second, faint sounds of conversation and soft laughter returned. They began to carry themselves differently, still prisoners, but no longer shadows. A Red Cross nurse, Margaret Ellison, later wrote in her field report, "They held their heads high. Whatever they had lost, something of soldierly bearing returned to them. The Americans noticed it too." For the Guards, this change did not go unnoticed. A few weeks earlier, they had treated male German POWs with open suspicion, sometimes hostility. But when the women arrived, discipline improved, tempers cooled, and order became effortless. It wasn't leniency. It was professionalism meeting professionalism. When one American lieutenant asked a guard why he rose again as the women passed one afternoon, the reply was simple: because they'd have done the same for us. To outsiders, it might have seemed insignificant, but in that compound, the act of standing up became symbolic, a quiet ritual of respect amid a world stripped of it. Historians later stewed too. Dying post-war behavior in Allied POW camps often cited incidents like this as examples of mutual recognition, moments when the rigid enemy lines blurred, replaced by a shared soldier's understanding. War had divided nations, but not erased the universal code of conduct learned on parade grounds long before ideology entered the uniform. Letters home from Guards reveal the lasting impression. Private Robert Hale wrote to his wife in June 1945, "You wouldn't believe it. They came in like ghosts of another army. We just stood, couldn't help it. I guess we all remembered what it meant once." Even months later, when most of the women were transferred to other holding centres, the men who had been there still referred to that day in reverent tones. To them, it was the only time since the war's end that they felt something clean, something decent, had happened inside the camp. No one photographed it, no journalist reported it. The event lived only in memory, passed through letters, logs, and fading recollections. But historians would later trace its importance through small clues: the unusually respectful treatment of female POWs in that region, the calm efficiency recorded in inspection reports, and the post-war interviews where both sides described a moment of mutual recognition. For the German women, that moment became a paradox they carried for years. They had served a defeated regime, some willingly, others by duty. They had witnessed moral collapse and total ruin. Yet in the presence of their captors, they had found an unexpected form of honour, not through victory, but through the shared discipline that outlived it. One of them, identified decades later as Lieutenant Erika Steiler, summarized it during an oral history interview in 1973. "We did not know whether to feel proud or ashamed. They rose for us, and we knew it was not mockery. It was the soldier's last courtesy, in a world without armies." That simple act, standing up, transcended every order, every flag, every victory. It did not forgive, nor did it absolve. It merely acknowledged that even in defeat, some remerté or nants of respect could survive the wreckage of ideology. In that hall on that morning, there had been no fanfare, no speeches, no flags, only silence. And in that silence, the war briefly lost its hatred. It was the kind of moment history rarely records, but those who witnessed it never forgot. When the war ended in May 1945, the Allied powers faced an enormous, chaotic task: the administration of more than 11 million German prisoners of war scattered across Europe. Among them were tens of thousands of women, nurses, communication clerks, Luftwaffe auxiliaries, and administrative officers, who had served in support of the Third Reich's military machine. Most Allied soldiers had never faced female combatants before. The Geneva Convention provided clear rules for POW treatment: yet few manuals accounted for women in uniform. Commanders, uncertain of protocol, relied on discipline and instinct. In many American-run facilities, that instinct leaned toward fairness, a quiet professionalism that rejected humiliation. At the U.S. camp where the standing incident occurred, the example spread silently. New guards copied what they saw from the veterans. When female officers entered or passed, men straightened their backs, boots together, eyes forward, not as a salute of allegiance, but as a gesture of acknowledgement. Reports from the International Red Cross confirm that conditions in American-run German POW camps, especially for women, were markedly better than those under other Allied authorities. Inspections noted that prisoners were housed in segregated but humane conditions, with access to medical care and limited correspondence privileges. It wasn't kindness, it was order. For men who had spent years seeing Europe consumed by brutality, restoring structure and respect was a way of reclaiming humanity itself. Across occupied Germany, similar small moments occurred. In Bavaria, British guards allowed captured Luftwaffe nurses to retain their rank insignia until official processing. In France, US officers ordered that female prisoners be addressed formally by rank and last name to maintain decorum. None of these gestures were recorded as policy. Yet together they reflected a quiet transformation taking place within the Allied ranks, a shift from vengeance to principle. Historians examining post-war records often note this pattern. After years of propaganda-driven hatred, soldiers on both sides slowly rediscovered that war was fought between armies, not between genders or civilians. It was a return to the ancient military code, respect for discipline, even in defeat. The women who experienced it carried those memories through decades of silence. Few spoke openly about their captivity. Shame and social stigma followed them in post-war Germany, where service under Hitler's banner became a mark of disgrace. But in private letters, fragments of the story resurfaced. One former Luftwaffe officer wrote to a friend in 1948, "The Americans stood when we entered. It was more painful than scorn. They treated us as equals, and we knew then that we had lost everything." In psychological terms, that reaction made sense. For those indoctrinated under the Nazi ideal of superiority, respect from the victors was more unsettling than humiliation. It stripped away ideological armor and forced a confrontation with reality. Defeat, shown with dignity, was harder to bear. Among US personnel, the experience had its own impact. Guards who had expected to despise their prisoners often found themselves questioning what they had been taught to hate. One wrote years later in a veteran's newsletter, "They looked like our own sisters, same age, same eyes. You realized we could have been them if we'd been born over there." Moments like these, small and unrecorded, helped lay the emotional groundwork for the post-war reconciliation that would eventually define US-German relations. By the 1950s, American and German military officers would train together under NATO. The shared discipline that once bridged a POW haul now underpinned an alliance. Looking back, historians often struggle to quantify the meaning of gestures like standing up for a prisoner. There were no medals for it, no records beyond scattered notes in diaries and Red Cross reports. But its influence lingered, in policy, in conduct, in the quiet professionalism that later defined Western military ethics. That morning in 1945 did not change the war's outcome. It did not absolve crimes, nor erase the suffering unleashed by the Nazi regime. But within the ruins of Germany, it offered a small, wordless preview of what post-war humanity might look like. Respect without illusion, dignity without victory. And for those who witnessed it, that was enough. A reminder that even in the grey aftermath of history's darkest war, the soldier's code had not entirely died. In the years that followed the war, that fleeting moment in the US POW camp faded quietly into the background of larger history, overshadowed by the grand narratives of victory, reconstruction, and the Nuremberg trials. No newspaper ever mentioned it, no historian wrote it down at the time. Yet for those who had stood in that hall or watched from the sidelines, it remained etched in memory, not as spectacle, but as proof that even in war's ashes, honor could still breathe. The American soldiers who had participated were soon discharged, returning to civilian life across the Atlantic. Many carried the image with them, the sound of boots, the stillness, the silent recognition between former enemies. For some, it marked the true end of their war, more so than any surrender ceremony or victory parade. One of them, Sergeant Thomas Leary, mentioned it briefly in his memoir, Letters from the End of War, 1952. They walked in like soldiers who remembered the rules when the world had forgotten them. We stood because we were soldiers too. It wasn't respect for what they fought for. It was respect for what they once were. That sentiment reflected a broader truth emerging in the 1950s, the rehumanization of the enemy. As the Cold War began, yesterday's foes became today's allies. American attitudes toward Germans softened rapidly, aided by stories, whispered, unrecorded ones like this, that reminded people that not all who wore the uniform of the Reich were monsters. In Germany, the memory of captivity carried its own complicated legacy. Former female officers, once symbols of a fallen ideology, struggled to rebuild their identities in a nation under occupation and moral reconstruction. They rarely spoke of the moment when American guards had stood for them, not out of pride, but out of fear of misunderstanding. How could they explain that dignity had been shown to them, the defeated, by those who had destroyed their nation? Only decades later, as the wounds of war began to fade, did fragments of the story reappear in oral histories and academic research. The German Federal Archives preserved a handful of testimonies from female POWs, including a 1971 account by Oberleutnant Ingrid Hoffmann, likely the same officer seen leading the first group into the camp. It was the only moment in captivity when I felt like a soldier again. They stood for us, not for Germany, not for Hitler, but for the discipline we all once believed meant something. Such recollections carried no bitterness, only reflection. Historians examining post-war reconciliation later identified these small human gestures as the first cracks in hatred. After 6 years of total war, of mass bombings, atrocities, and ideological warfare, simple acts of mutual respect represented a quiet rediscovery of red humanity. In that sense, the moment when American guards rose for their prisoners became emblematic of something larger, the moral recovery of the Western soldier. It was a transformation visible in post-war military codes as well. The U.S. Army's 1949 Field Manual on the Law of Land Warfare explicitly reaffirmed humane treatment for prisoners, with emphasis on respect for rank and gender, lessons drawn from the mixed experiences of 1945. The document's tone suggested an awareness that dignity shown to an enemy is not weakness, but discipline. For the women who had been there, that knowledge offered an unexpected solace. They were never celebrated, never interviewed on television, never written into the grand chronicles of the Reich's fall. But in the smallest, most private corners of their memories, they kept one image: American soldiers rising silently, as if reminding them that they were still human. By the 1980s, as the generation of World War II veterans aged, researchers began piecing together individual recollections from both sides. At least 3 separate oral histories referenced the day the guards stood. Each described the same atmosphere: quiet, confusion, and a sense of shared fatigue that transcended uniforms. To historians, it symbolized something larger than itself. It showed that moral behavior does not require orders, that even when nations collapse, individuals can still choose respect over scorn. In that silence between soldiers, there was no forgiveness, but there was understanding. The gesture did not erase the crimes of the regime those women had served, nor did it glorify them. It simply reminded both sides that professionalism, when divorced from ideology, can become a bridge back to civilization. And in that sense, it became one of the war's final victories, not of armies, but of character. History often remembers wars through numbers, battles won, soldiers lost, nations rebuilt. But history's true measure lies in its silences, in the quiet moments when men and women choose decency over vengeance. The day American guards stood for German female officers was one of those silences. No shots fired, no flags raised, no medals awarded. Just a brief pause in a world still vibrating from destruction, when soldiers on opposite sides remembered, if only for a moment, that discipline and dignity were not enemies. That single gesture revealed something essential about the human condition, that morality, when stripped of ideology, often returns to its simplest form: respect. It was not sympathy, not forgiveness. It was the instinct of trained soldiers acknowledging one another across the ruins of ideology when all other structures had collapsed. In the long arc of post-war history, moments like these became invisible threads binding former foes together. They hinted that civilization could rebuild itself not merely through treaties or reconstruction, but through memory, through small moral decisions made by ordinary men who had seen too much war to hate any longer. For the German women who endured captivity with quiet resolve, and for the American soldiers who stood without orders, the moment passed quickly. Yet it endured in their minds as something purer than victory, a fragment of honor reclaimed from chaos. When we look back at the Second World War, we often search for lessons about power, strategy, and leadership. But sometimes the clearest lessons come from the spaces in between, where no one sought glory and no one sought recognition. In that brief act of standing, simple, wordless, human, the soldiers of two defeated moral worlds met as equals. And in that meeting, history found a glimpse of its own redemption.